Well, thanks for coming along this morning. Thanks to Penny Wong being here as well. The final budget outcome that we're releasing today shows Australia's public finances continue to be among the strongest in the developed world. Both our budget balance and net debt remain well below the levels in other major advanced economies. Plus, we have that great combination: solid growth, low unemployment, contained inflation, and a record investment pipeline, and we continue to outperform just about every other developed economy. We still have, however, the lingering impacts of the global financial crisis, and they're certainly still being felt in our budget. In particular, tax receipts are still well down on pre-crisis levels. Nevertheless, our fiscal position remains in very good shape. This has been recently recognised by the International Monetary Fund, and of course it has been reaffirmed by rating agencies. They have reaffirmed our top-tier AAA credit rating. Now, the underlying cash deficit for 2011-12 showed a small improvement of $661 million from the May budget estimate. This is the smallest variation between the budget estimate and the final outcome for a decade. Good work, Penny. This improvement since the budget estimate was relatively evenly split between slightly lower payments and slightly higher receipts. But the budget is still suffering from the after effects of the global financial crisis and international instability. Tax receipts remain low as a proportion of GDP by historical standards, with accumulated losses continuing to flow through the tax system. This forms a part of the $150 billion write-down in tax receipts over 5 years that we've seen since the 2008-9 budget. As I've said on a number of occasions, because of factors like the high Australian dollar, a cautious consumer, subdued asset prices, and the investment boom, we don't expect taxes to return to pre-crisis levels over the forward estimates. And we can see that in the numbers yet again today. If we look to, for example, company taxes, they've come in $876 million lower than expected. And as I will mention in a minute, we have further write-downs, or will have further write-downs at MyEFO as well. Now, despite these headwinds, it's still obvious that Australia's fiscal position is much healthier than most other developed economies. At 3% of GDP, or $43.7 billion, our 2011 deficit is less than half the average budget deficit recorded for the major advanced economies in 2011. And you can see that demonstrated there in the chart. And we are returning the budget to surplus well ahead of every major advanced economy. Also, you can see, in terms of the next chart, our net debt is dramatically lower than other major advanced economies. Our net debt was 10% of GDP in 2011-12. For the major advanced economies, it averaged 83.5% of GDP in 2011. Now, I do want to make this point about net debt. Now, some of you may have noticed that it's increased a little since the May budget estimate. It's important to understand how this has happened. Debt issuance in 2011-12 was actually lower than forecast in the budget. We have fewer Commonwealth bonds on issue than we thought in the May budget. The increase in net debt is driven by falling interest rates on our already issued debt. Net debt is measured at market value, and when interest rates fall, the market value of our debt goes up, hence the slight increase in net debt. So what we've seen is that our strong fiscal position has been recognised in the past week by the IMF and the credit rating agency Standard & Poor's, who've reaffirmed our AAA rating. What this points to is the strength of our economy, the decisive action we took during the global financial crisis to avoid a recession, and our credible fiscal policy and our strict fiscal discipline. We stepped in to support the economy when there was a challenge from the global economy, and now we are bringing the budget back to surplus, putting in place strict fiscal discipline. So we have a credible path for fiscal consolidation by returning the budget to surplus in 2012-13, and we remain committed to delivering a surplus as Australia's best defence at a time of ongoing global turbulence. Now, it's also obvious that commodity prices have declined somewhat in recent months, and they do remain substantially lower than what we factored into our budget forecasts. And this will hit government revenues significantly, which does make it harder to deliver a budget surplus. So it does mean we will have to find more savings. But we do have a proven track record of finding responsible and measured savings which accord with Labor values, and we'll do that again. I'll just hand over to Penny to make a few remarks.
Thanks very much, Treasurer. Just a few brief remarks. Well, the final budget outcome shows again that this government is running a disciplined and responsible approach when it comes to the budget. As the Treasurer said, we've come very close to the 11-12 expectations in the FBO, with the final underlying cash deficit at $43.7 billion, just less than the $44.4 estimated in the May budget. You'll see in the document a range of payments referenced, which are slightly different from that at budget. I do want to just remark on one, which is the payments under the Natural Disaster Relief and Recovery arrangements. It's important to note that payments to Queensland in total to date under those arrangements from the Commonwealth to Queensland as a result of the 10-11 floods is now is $4.2 billion. We're budgeting for further payments in the order of $3 billion, and in addition the Commonwealth has paid just over $1 billion in financial assistance to individuals affected by natural disasters in Queensland. So $4.2 billion to date under NDRRA, with $3 billion further to come, plus the individual assistance, financial assistance to people concerned. Cash payments in 11-12 were $305 million less than estimated at budget, a variance of less than 1% of total payments. And of course, as you know, we've set out our plans in the budget to deliver the fastest fiscal consolidation since at least the 1960s, savings of some $34 billion identified in the last budget across the forward estimates, adding to the $100 billion in our previous 4 Labor budgets, many of them structural reforms which also strengthen the long-term budget position. So this government continues to make the necessary decisions to deliver a strong budget position for the country, and will continue to do so. Thanks very much.
I just wanted to make one further comment before we take your questions. We've seen another outburst from Mr Abbott this morning in complete defiance of the facts. He said this on 2GB this morning, and I quote, "Rather than talking to African countries, trying to drum up the numbers to get us a temporary seat on the UN Security Council, she, that is the Prime Minister, should be in Jakarta talking to President Yudhoyono." Well, if Mr Abbott had bothered to check his facts, he'd know that the President is actually in New York at the moment. That is a clear matter of public record. This is yet another example of reckless negativity from the Leader of the Opposition in complete defiance of the facts and common sense. Mr Abbott ought to retract his statements immediately. He ought to apologise for them, and he ought to give an undertaking that he's going to give up this reckless negativity, which is always in complete defiance of the facts. I mean, this was the Leader of the Opposition who did not have the courage when he last met with the President of Indonesia to even raise his so-called towbacks policy. Over to you.
Mr Swan, in your statement you say tax receipts are $26 billion below the estimate before the global financial crisis. The Treasury Secretary, Martin Parkinson, has been warning that you'll be $20 billion down on pre-GFC levels for some time to come. How do you reconcile that with ambitious spending programs on things like Gonski and the NDIS?
Well, let's deal with that in, I guess, 2 parts. The first part we have to deal with is what's happened to our revenues since the onset of the global financial crisis, which is basically the 08-09 budget. And in that time, our revenues have been written down to the tune of $150 billion. It's gone through the budget, it's had a dramatic impact, and it still lingers. So revenues this year are down something like $26 billion. So what we've determined to do in the face of that is to come back to surplus by making responsible savings to make sure that we have that path of fiscal consolidation that I was talking about before. And when it goes to the future, we can see there is a further threat to our revenues from lower commodity prices. I've already said today that we'll be looking for responsible savings. But in the middle of all of that, the thing that I'm proudest of most about this government is that we have found room for our priorities, for our labour priorities, putting in place paid parental leave, making sure that we had the essential investments in education and so on that were required. And as we go forward, we will continue to do that. We've had big revenue write-downs, and of course there is challenges to the revenues, but we will absolutely stick with our fiscal discipline, and as we put in place responses to new challenges, we'll find the savings in the budget to do that and to change priorities. That's what we've been doing so far, and that's what we will continue to do.
Proportionately, one of the biggest changes or variations is in the revenue for tobacco, which is down 341 million since the budget. What do you put that down to?
Well, if you look at page 4, receipts, it refers, figure's a bit different to the one you just quoted.
I'm just looking at the table.
Lower than expected excise and customs duty of around 149 million, below the budget estimate, mainly reflecting weaker than expected tobacco collection. So I'm sure people will make judgments about what's driving that, but the figures demonstrate that even since budget, we're collecting less excise and customs duty on those items.
So do you think the government's campaign is working?
Well, I certainly think the government's campaign is the right thing to do, and it may well be having an effect. It's, finance ministers probably just look at the numbers rather than talk about the public health reasons. But you would think that there'd be some effect.